I'm just grateful that I know this person, Kevin Chandler, who's a relatively new member at Christ Church, lives up in Port Washington. You've probably seen him in the summer. You've seen him in the back pews here. A faithful Episcopalian. Christ Church, Charlotte? Is that where you? Charlottesville. Charlottesville, not Charlotte, Virginia, not North Carolina. Let's keep talking about changing that. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to just turn things over to you, and you're welcome to fire up your mic, and then take it away.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming out. I know this is the first non-rainy day we've had in a while, so thanks for being inside for a little bit longer to listen to me talk. So figure just, first a couple of caveats. You'll notice this slideshow that I'm going through, it becomes slightly less thorough as we get closer to the end, and it's because we have two toddlers, one who just started preschool in August, and we've been living its state of readiness in terms of sniffles in our house, and we were dealing with that again this week with them. So I didn't get to finish quite everything. So please bear with me there. And then, I think hopefully this is interesting for folks. If it gets too boring or dry at any point, just feel free to let out an audible groan, and I'll move on. And then if I'm reading Seth's email from a week or two ago, if anybody falls asleep, I'll choose to believe that you really need that sleep, and that's okay too.
We're a really good audience.
So just about me, yeah, I grew up in North Carolina, a little town on the coast, and went to school at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, thinking I was going to be a journalist, and got really fired up about environmental issues while in college, and sort of pivoted and moved back home for a little while, went to graduate school to study foreign relations, and then that was a period of time in my life when I thought I was going to be a diplomat focused on environmental issues, and then I moved to DC and got really involved in like campaigns and communication. So I worked for a number of environmental NGOs in DC, moved back home to North Carolina for a little while, and got more involved in energy issues, and moved to Charlottesville, Virginia, where I worked with a renewable energy developer based there that was really focused on building large-scale wind and solar and battery storage plants. We also focused on some distributed generation, things like community solar. And my roles really varied from community relations and community acceptance, so being actually engaged and involved in the communities where we're trying to build new power plants, trying to hopefully win support, answer questions and things like that. Got sort of drafted into the policy side for a while, and was our company's federal lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years, then oversaw our state government and regulatory affairs work across our entire portfolio. We worked in 20 or 30 states. And then I shifted into project development, thinking that I really wanted to see like something get built and try to be responsible for actual steel in the ground. And we have my wife, she grew up in the Chicago suburbs, but her family is scattered in Wisconsin and Chicago area. We had two kids and a pandemic, and I knew at some point moving to the Midwest was in the cards, and I'd started running out of reasons to say no, and here we are. And we've been in this area. We moved to Port Washington in August of last year, and so far so good. Found Christ Church not too long after that, so I've been coming for a year-ish, off and on, again, sporadic attendance with the two kids. And so I think for me, just the goal of the presentation in this talk really is to just kind of go through, my perspective is mostly on like the large scale, like the large wind and solar farms. I can answer any questions towards the end about some of the other stuff, rooftop solar and things like that. I might know more than the average bear, but I'm not an expert, so I might say, I don't know if you have questions. But what I really wanted to focus on today is like how the energy grid itself is changing and getting cleaner, and what's driving that and how fast it's happening, and then we can hopefully, I'm happy to answer questions for as long as anybody has questions. So this is my attempt at internet humor. How it started with just a handful of people in the 60s and 70s designing solar panels, and how it's going. And then, so this chart is global renewable energy employment, and by technology, but really over the past 10 years, or 8 years, this is 2020, but you can really see that the number of jobs in renewable energy has just exploded, and it's probably significantly higher just over the past couple of years. And that's happening because people are finally waking up and investing and devoting the time and resources to building renewable energy. And this is probably something that nobody can read, but I thought just for kind of a quick context, it might be helpful just to point out the broad history of the power grid and sort of why we are where we are. So the first distribution grid in the 1880s, the first transmission grid in 1896 in the United States. And then from there, it's like a rapid shift. So the 43 states having regulatory commissions, that really means that pretty quickly, states wanted to figure out how to regulate power and how to manage how power is distributed and how people are charged for it and who owns it. In 1935, during the Franklin Roosevelt administration, we really had the first federal electric regulation. So that created that utility structure that we're familiar with today, that created the federal jurisdiction over how energy is transmitted, and sort of codified that the state control of electrical rates and generally like the siting of projects. And then from there is like pretty rapid transition. It's funny, so my mom grew up, she was born in the 1950s in rural North Carolina, and she talks about how she knew people even then who still had no electricity in North Carolina at that point. And then, over the 60s, you triple the length of power lines, people, electrification is really just like growing. And then since the 70s and really from the 90s, you have like an opening of the electricity market. And so what that means is more types of power producers are allowed to access the market, independent power producers like the folks that I've worked with. And I should mention, I don't work for the Charlottesville company now. I work for a Chicago-based company called Invenergy, and my role now is I help develop long-distance transmission lines to transmit clean power to places where it's needed. And so transmission might be a heavy focus because it's like kind of a passion project of mine. But what you've seen in the 90s is the creation of RTOs, so regional transmission organizations, and independent system operators, which basically are just big energy markets where anybody can sell into the market, and it creates more opportunities for more diverse types of power production. It creates more transmission between, more sending of electrons between states and regions and things like that. And then this slide is just the generation over time since 1950. So what you see in 1950, really like pretty small amount of electricity compared to what we have today. And it was a makeup of coal, a decent amount of natural gas, and a pretty decent chunk of renewables, which is actually the hydropower. So a lot of hydro dams were built in that time, and that was really renewable energy for decades in the United States. And then pretty rapid growth of electrification. So more people having access to electricity, homes getting bigger, people having more things that need to be electrified, and so and population growth, obviously. So the demand for energy is taking off. And then the story of really the past 10 years, you see first is kind of like a leveling off a little bit of the total amount of electricity that's produced in the country. And I think I don't really know that. If I had to hypothesize, I would say that energy efficiency has played a big role in that. And you also see the mix, though, at the same time that the total demand is staying the same. The mix is changing. So coal is, going down really hugely. Natural gas is taking up a much bigger total component of the generation. Nuclear has stayed kind of the same. It hasn't really gotten bigger in several decades, and then renewables are getting bigger. And this is how the renewable makeup has been shifting over the past couple of decades. So again, this is the hydropower that's stayed kind of stagnant over the past several decades. But over on the right, huge up curve here, and where wind in particular has really taken off over the past 15 years. And then more recently, solar is gobbling up a ever bigger chunk of the power grid. And so wind, now this shows sort of the share of renewables, but right now 24% roughly of our energy grid is made up of renewable power, and wind is about, I would say 10 to 15% of that. I don't know off the top of my head, but wind is the single biggest chunk of renewable energy now. It's surpassed hydro, and solar is getting more and more of a foothold every year. And I think in general, you're seeing more solar built in recent years than wind, just because a lot of you're more competition for new areas of wind development. A lot of the really, really good sites have been developed, because wind is really, it's driven by resource. You want to have access to the wind, and so it's by nature a little limited. And then the transmission grid as it exists in the really windy areas is a little tapped out, which is what I'm focused on, and a number of other companies are focused on, where how can you build new power lines from really windy areas and deliver it to places where it's needed. And that's going to be a really important component of total investment in the next couple of years. But as it stands, solar still has a lot of room to grow, because you can put it on rooftops, you can put it in unused fields, you can put it on farm fields, you can put it in parking lots. There's a lot of places where you can put solar, and we haven't really accessed most of those yet. And I think it's important to just recognize too, why are we interested in renewable energy? First, obviously it's cleaner. It doesn't emit carbon, we know that, but also NOx and a lot of the other pollutants that come from generating coal, they're not existent with renewable energy. It also doesn't really use water, and so that's something that a lot of people don't focus on. Once a wind farm is running, you're not using any water. Solar, maybe you're having to wash panels, but it's not relying on a water source to run. It's inexpensive to install these days, and more inexpensive to operate too. There's no fuel cost associated with renewable energy, so you don't have any variable sets of costs. Once it's installed, you know what that factor is, and then you rely on that free energy for forever. And the distributed nature of renewable energy too has some security benefits and just overall redundancy in the grid. Even if you're talking about large wind farms and large solar farms, there's going to be more of them than having a big 3,000 or 4,000 megawatt power plant in one place. It actually is pretty secure to have diverse sets of generation spread all over the country. And then also it's really massive potential for jobs across all skill sets. I mean, one thing that I talk to people about is that for a coal plant or a nuclear plant, you have a lot of jobs right there. Maybe you have some jobs in mining, but they're pretty concentrated. And what's really crazy about the renewable energy industry is that there are so many varying types of jobs across the entire skill set. So from installing and operating wind farms, I think wind farm technician a year or two ago was the fastest growing job in the country, and it's a job which you can get paid pretty decent money with an associate's degree, right? Or sometimes less. And those jobs are in high demand, and then all the way up to highly skilled engineers and finance positions and things like that. So it's a pretty variable source of employment, and it's spread across the country. It's spread across the different manufacturing centers. It's spread across to everywhere where you're having to build new projects, and so that's one of the reasons why I think it's really exciting, because it really is a new opportunity for a lot of people. And so now, really focusing a little bit more on the drivers of growth, and I've highlighted 4 things here. There's obviously more than 4 things, but cost declines, the consumer demand, over utility goals, and then policy choices that have been made to support the industry. This is not going to be easy to read, but this is from a bank called Lazard. And every year they put out a study of energy cost, and called the levelized cost of energy. And what it really refers to is how much does it cost when you strip out all of the subsidies involved with all the sources? What are the costs of the energy? And this shows the decline in wind over the past decade or so. And this is solar. Solar is a really steep cost decline curve here. And the things that are driving that is just research and development. We're getting new technologies, they're more efficient, they're better. We're getting better at knowing where to put systems so that they produce more power and better power. And then just the more you build of something, the cheaper it gets. And this is, yeah.
Can you go back to that last slide?
Sure.
So how do these costs compare to, let's say, petroleum or coal or other, or?
If you can wait 2 slides, we'll get there. This is just a quick snapshot of the technology improvement in wind, and really, like, it kind of comes down to turbines getting bigger and having more capacity. And so this is the average turbine in 1990, 89 feet tall, pretty quaint compared to some of the offshore turbines that we're seeing now that are potentially 500 feet in the next 10 years. And this is where we come to the cost comparison here. I have a better slide that comes next, but this shows the Lazard cost estimate for across the typical kinds of generation. Wind is up there in the middle, the $26 to $50 range, and that's location dependent. And then natural gas is down here at the bottom, and you can see it's pretty in line with wind. This number that's really cheap to the left is the operational cost. And then solar is up there, it's still in that range. And so that's why the headline here is really like the grid that we're seeing today is the story of gas and renewables. And those are, I think, the 3 things that are making up the modern energy grid. Coal is continues to be out of favor for a number of utilities because of cost reasons. Obviously, there's environmental reasons, but you're seeing more and more coal retirements and more renewables and gas additions. And I think, in general, every year the new sources of energy coming online, it's really only those 3. There's some new nuclear that's coming on in Georgia right now, but there's not a lot of investment in nuclear. It's really these 3 things that are making up the grid of today.
When they're talking about the cost up here, do
Yeah.
they factor in costs of health detriments or,
I don't think so.
or environmental detriments?
I don't think so, and that's why if you really look at, I think the way the federal government phrases it, it's the social cost of carbon, which is like what is the cost that the carbon emissions are placing on society. I don't think it's in here. There might be some. I think there definitely are some studies that look at that.
Question.
Yes.
Is there still,
For people at home, they won't get up here.
Is there still government subsidies involved in the development of solar and wind to encourage companies to do that? And if so, how big is that as a percentage of cost?
In terms of percentage of cost, I don't have that answer. But yeah, so really, when you think about the encouragement of solar and wind, it's primarily what you call the production tax credit for wind, and then the solar investment tax credit for solar. And the production tax credit was first started, I think, 1992. Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa, who's still around, he was the first person to spearhead that. And it's kind of like a boom and bust cycle over the past couple decades. It was recently the Inflation Reduction Act that passed several months ago, had a ton of energy and climate measures in there. There was a lot to say about that in that bill. And really what the PTC is, it's a per kilowatt hour credit for how much energy you produce. So if you're not producing energy, you don't get the credit. For the for the investment tax credit, it's a percentage of your investment, of the total investment in the facility that is returned as a tax credit. And then there's still subsidies involved for coal and gas and nuclear and things like that too. Nuclear, in recent years, you've seen a lot of policy encouragement to keep them running. So for nuclear plants that are more expensive to operate often these days than new renewables, but they've been around for a long time, they serve a lot of energy. And so policymakers, Illinois is a great example, they've decided, well, we have an interest in keeping this zero carbon energy online, and so they've come up with ways to encourage those nuclear plants to stay online. There's, for oil and gas, you have like favorable tax credits for the exploration, and I think it's called like accelerated depreciation for oil and gas wells and things like that. So pretty much every source of energy has some kind of tax code treatment, and I think it really comes down to there is an interest in making sure that we have reliable sources of energy and that people are out there willing to do it. And then one sort of other thing that has been bandied about in recent years is kind of going, how do you factor in that cost of carbon? And so that's a policy. The Citizens Climate Lobby, I think, is the most active group across the country that's pushing for that, which would be some sort of price on carbon to really charge for that pollution and help those, help equalize the cost in the marketplace. I'm not as familiar with that, but that's kind of like a next level policy that some folks have wanted to see.
Hi.
Hey.
I don't know, is this working? Yeah. I saw a special on tulip-looking wind.
Yeah.
Do you know something about those?
I don't know much about it. I know that there have been a lot of new ideas to like different kinds of wind turbines. None of them have really like taken off, and I don't know if it's hard for me to know if any of them have legs or not.
It really looks special. I mean, they said they could be much closer together.
Yeah.
They could fit in backyards, so it's exciting to see that there's so many innovations out there.
Yeah, I think so. And there's a ton of, if you guys want, we can just jettison this, and we can skip around a little bit. But there's a, so this is some of the other technologies that I think that are really interesting, that are either already here. Offshore wind is really present in a number of other countries. It's really starting to spool up in the United States. Invenergy, my company, has an offshore lease in New York. There's a lot of development in Virginia and the Carolinas right now, and it's really exciting because you can get turbines offshore where people don't have to see them, and you can harness really powerful winds that are pretty reliable, and you can build them bigger so you have more capacity. And especially for like the Northeast and New England, where it's pretty dense, it's hard for them to build big wind farms in like Rhode Island, where there's people everywhere. But if they can access this offshore wind and transmit it, it's a great way for them to meet their utility goals, because we'll jump back here. This is real. So this is the map of where, this is a map just showing states that already have 100% clean energy commitments. I think 1/3 of Americans live in one of these states now. They're all highlighted in green. And the rest of these states have some sort of renewable energy standard and target. And so that's a way that states are stepping in and saying, like, we want to set a value that we're going to produce cleaner energy, and we want to, they're encouraging their utilities and folks to make those investments. And so the Northeast is pretty covered with a lot of these commitments. And so one of the interesting ways for them to meet those commitments would be offshore wind. And kind of going back, similar to that, utility goals have been an important driver of this investment too. And at the end of 2020, it might be higher now, but 70% of the 30 largest utilities had net zero targets and mandates. And what that means is they have a goal to get carbon out of their system by a certain date. Getting halfway there by 2030 and 2035 is the standard midpoint goal, and I think that's really in line with what the Paris Climate Accords say we need to do. And then neutrality by 2050 or 2055, and just highlighting what utilities in Wisconsin are doing. So WEC, which owns We Energies, their goal is 60% by 25 and 80% by 30, and then by 2050, and then We Energies, similar levels. So these are pretty aggressive goals that they're going to have to work really hard to meet. And they're doing that by investing in renewable projects today and newer technologies down the road. Yes, ma'am.
How will We Energies get to net zero by 2050?
Oh, I have not read their integrated resource plan, but I would say, so I think that a lot of the reductions that have happened, so I live in Port Washington. I don't know if you all spend much time there, but there's a pretty big power plant right on the water. It's pretty visible. It was coal for forever, and by transitioning that into natural gas, they really greatly reduced the emissions there. I think they also increased the generation capacity when they did that. So that's cleaner energy that's coming out of that area. And they're investing a lot in wind and solar farms. They can invest in wind farms in other states as well because they are in the Midwest energy market. And then I would guess there's probably some encouragement for home energy efficiency and things like that. And it'd be really great if they were nicer about putting solar on roofs, because I would love to do that, but it's a little challenging. Yes, sir.
Okay. I worked in nuclear with Wisconsin Energy since, 1983. I retired in 79.
Okay.
Okay, so the Point Beach nuclear plant's what I supported for environmental issues.
Yeah.
And that's about 1,400 acres for the site. And my last 2 years there, they were preparing for the solar farm. So the solar farm on the Point Beach site is about 400 and some acres.
Yeah.
And the land around the site, which WE did not sell to Florida Power and Light for NextEra Energy, is also a huge solar farm. So there must be at least 600 to 800 acres of solar power right around the Point Beach nuclear plant. So, I mean, it's growing. And I worked for NextEra Energy, and we were the largest wind
Absolutely.
power electrical generator in the U.S. and even had some contracts with people in Spain, I believe, to have a solar or wind power plant. Plus, we had cogeneration plants in California. So it's growing.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
the problem I see, we still need base load plants until we get some sort of a good battery system to hold all the energy we're generating while the sun is shining and while the wind is blowing. So I think that's the big sort of pinch point in this whole
Sure.
non-polluting energy sources.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's why you're seeing the continued investment in gas and the interest in keeping nuclear plants running, and then also like the next generation of technology. You're seeing a lot of interesting things happen in long duration storage. For example, there's a company called Form Energy that's invented a new type of battery that runs off like iron air. I'm not an engineer or a chemist, so I can't really describe it, but it can store power for, they claim, up to 100 hours, which really, most of the battery storage that's coming online right now is like 4 to 8 hours, maybe 12 hours, but to be able to do that over days to smooth things out is really exciting. You're seeing a lot of interest in like advanced, more nuclear, like maybe smaller scale modular reactors. I think that's all pretty tough. It's a pretty tough business market, but Bill Gates and a lot of people with big pocketbooks are really investing heavily in it, and I think that's getting at the idea of how do you have that baseload power, how do you do that? And the other thing too is that with grid expansion, so one of the challenges is not just we don't have enough wind power online, but the way that the transmission grid as it currently exists is pretty tapped out. A lot of these lines are older, and if we had more energy highways, you could also have more reliability with a higher penetration of wind and solar. I've seen studies that show that hypothesize that you could have anywhere from like an 80 to 90+% renewable grid if you had enough transmission and enough reliability across the country. And so that's something the bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed previously had a lot of funding opportunities for new transmission investment. And so I think what's really exciting about what's happening right now is there's so much investment and so much energy in how can we clean things up. And there's so many different ideas that there's no one way. It's not like 50 years ago when you built a power plant and that was it. And now there are so many different unique opportunities to decarbonize things and to make things more secure. And it's not going to be one technology or two technologies. It's going to be a half dozen or more. NextEra is a really great example of a company that has gone from the traditional utility. They are by far one of the biggest developers of renewable energy in the country. And Invenergy, I think, is the largest private developer, and NextEra is the largest publicly owned company, and they're doing some really interesting stuff. Yes, ma'am.
I was not able to be here in the beginning, so I
You didn't miss
apologize if I am asking a question that was already delivered.
Sure.
Two things. One, maintenance, comparing all of these systems, are they looking at all of those kinds of costs? And two, safety.
So maintenance is, I don't know if this really gets to what you're asking, but this is the, on the right here, you have what they call the marginal cost of existing generation. That's like how much does it cost to continue to operate it. And then this is how much does it cost to build new wind and solar. And what you see is they're kind of in line. Wind can be cheaper than maintaining existing generation to a degree, but in general, I don't have a good answer on like how much the maintenance costs. I will say that when it comes to maintaining a gas plant versus a wind and solar plant, it's different, right? So for a wind farm, you have anywhere from, I would say on average, 10 to 15 people who work on the site, and there's typically like an O&M building, and sometimes it's just a shed, sometimes it's pretty sophisticated, where the workers come every day, and their job is to really make sure the turbines keep spinning without breaking, and they spend most of their time going up and down 200-300 foot structures. I've been offered the opportunity to go up one before, and I'm not going to do it. 6'5" is high enough for me. I don't need to go much bigger than that. But it's really like, and some of them have elevators, and some of them they have to climb a ladder the whole way. It's pretty intense, and so they're monitoring the system as well. So it's a pretty sophisticated network of computers and sensors that are making sure that things aren't spinning too fast and things are optimized. And there's really a lot of nuance to how you operate a wind farm, because it's not always just as simple as if the wind is blowing, you're generating. If there's not enough power demand on the system right then you can feather the blades and stop it. If there's a really crazy storm that comes through, like a hurricane or tornado, you can stop the blades, and usually you don't see a lot of impact there. And they can turn individual turbines on and off, so they can optimize how much power is getting generated. And the same for solar, although it's a little bit less complicated. And then I'm not too familiar with what goes into the operations and maintenance on like a traditional facility, but it's usually more workers, and you're focused on fuel supply and things like that. But I think in general, the operation of a wind farm is way more sophisticated than I would have guessed going into it. And that's one of the really interesting job opportunities out there in the field, is that actually getting, not just working on the farms themselves, but companies I previously worked with, and Invenergy, they have pretty sophisticated control centers at their headquarters where engineers and people who are monitoring everything that's going on in real time, and it's really secure. It's really cool stuff. So I don't know if that was a good answer, maybe not, but yeah.
An outside United States kind of energy,
Sure.
are we more vulnerable with these kinds of forms of energy?
I don't think so. And this is, everything I'm saying today is not on behalf of my employer or anybody else. This is, but I would say that one interesting thing about having so many different power plants is that even if one goes down, you have more redundancy in the system rather than having a handful of really large plants. By not having a fuel supply, by not having a pipeline that can be turned on or off, that's adds some security. There's also, cybersecurity is a big aspect of any energy plan right now too, though. The security of the grid, the security of the plants themselves, and everyone is investing a ton of time and resources into making sure that your digital defenses are high enough that you can avoid those attacks. But I think in general, the distributed grid is very safe and secure. And then worker safety, obviously, when you have somebody who's up 300 or 400 feet in the air, that's a big consideration. And I've seen firsthand that they take that very, very seriously. A lot of the people who actually maintain these projects, it's a lot of like former military operators, and I've seen a lot of what I've heard from them is there's a lot of crossover where it's like a team atmosphere, and they have to. It's the similar like buddy system and the safety and a lot of the same mentality carries over into that operation as well. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
I have a couple of small questions
Sure.
about solar panels. Number one, what happens to a solar panel when there's a heavy snowstorm?
Yeah.
Do they just sit and wait for the snow to melt? That's one question. The other one was I began to wonder if someday we would have things like solar panels on the top of semis so that the semis are now operating with their very own power.
Yeah. On the snow, that's a great question. I think it depends a little bit on where you are, but I don't know that. I don't know that for sure. I know that you do have a lot of. I know that they do have companies that clean solar panels and things like that. So I imagine that if you're in Wisconsin, there'll be somebody who can come out and help clean that off. I truthfully don't know how that works. And then on the trucking. I don't know about semis. I know there are some companies that are trying to create cars that run on solar energy, and one, I think, actually made it like 600 something miles with solar. There's also been some interesting ideas about how could you incorporate solar into asphalt and highways, and I'm not familiar with all of that, but people are really thinking about it.
I could just mention, we had solar powers on our house in Indiana. We installed them when we first moved there. And it cost $20,000 for the panels. We had a $6,000 tax credit from the federal government, which was helpful, so $14,000. Our electric bills, once we had the panels installed, was $0. We paid $15 to the energy company to make up for when our panels weren't producing as much as we used.
Wow.
When we sold our house, we left with I think it was 1,200 credits of solar power energy. So we operated on a credit basis. And during January, to answer your question, we had snow on our panels. We didn't produce for a few days, but because of how much sun there was in general in January, we still produced in January, not as much as we did in the summer, but overall, enough to make it so that we didn't ever pay any energy bills. And I felt good. We had a pool at our old house, and we're running a pump all summer every day. And I felt guilty when prior homes, when we had a pool, because it's kind of pricey to pay for the electricity and for air conditioning. But I felt like, if I want it to be 65 in here, I did not, but I could have it at 65 and not live with my guilt conscience.
I love that. Great. So I think this is, I had a couple of slides about consumer demand for renewable energy. We don't need to spend much time there. I think the key thing for here is that obviously it's really important for people, but also one of the other big drivers of new investment has been corporations and bigger companies, everybody from the Amazons and Googles of the world to a lot of bigger companies that you've never heard of. They have these same energy goals. They're similar. Most of the time they're similar in scope to what you see from utilities, and they have a net zero goal by 2050 and something halfway by 2030. And I think that was really a reaction to the lack of policy for a number of years and them trying to step in and fill the void. But businesses who are contracting for renewable power projects are one of the biggest sources of new demand out there. And so a PPA is a power purchase agreement. It's really just a long-term contract from a company to buy power from a project. Hit 33.1 gigawatts in 2021. That's bigger than the total energy demand of some small countries. And I think that was in the United States alone, but it might be globally. But it's a massive driver for them. They're doing this for environmental reasons, sure, for some PR reasons, but also for cost too, because if you can lock in an energy price for 10 or 15 years, that's a lot of certainty that's really helpful for you, and oftentimes that power price is lower than what they're getting now. And so it's kind of a triple win for them. We touched on the utility goals. This is just kind of on the federal policy that we asked about what subsidies exist. Historically, that really has been tax credits and then research and development. And FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It's like the most powerful body you've never heard of. And they manage interstate transmission, they permit pipelines and things like that, but they're the ones who set the policies that really open, they created the opening for independent power producers. They mandated the creation of the regional transmission organizations that have driven a lot of this, so it's really important stuff. And then recently you had the infrastructure law that I mentioned, which for me, the transmission stuff was really exciting. The Inflation Reduction Act, which has stuff to say about tax credits for wind and solar, but also for all kinds of other new technologies as well. And then the Biden administration has a federal target similar to what you've seen elsewhere, and then the rejoining of the Paris Climate Accords. And I stole this from the New York Times because this is the projection of where the Inflation Reduction Act could get us by 2030. And so if you kind of assume that most people are targeting 50% by 2030, the projection is that the climate law that was passed could get us almost there. I tend to try to be an optimistic person. If you start with the assumption that we should get there, it's a personal thing, but I think that I'm very excited about the possibility that we should. And I actually think that with a lot of the new technologies out there, whether it's new opportunities for decarbonizing vehicles and other stuff, I actually think that we can accelerate and get there. But there are some challenges that I spend a lot of time thinking a lot about. I don't know why I'm looking up here. I can also look here, but it seems more friendly. But I think like losing focus on implementation, so not doing the hard work, it's really easy to set a goal. It's like a New Year's resolution. I write something down every year, and most of the time I lose interest pretty quickly. And likewise, if you're not focused on implementing these laws in a way that's effective and also that's effective and sustainable, it's going to be challenging. And there's always the danger of policy rollbacks too, that somebody could change something down the line. The community acceptance of renewable energy is something that I like to highlight too, because it's, as somebody who spent the better part of a decade in rural communities, trying to build acceptance for new power projects, it's a big decision for a community. Especially for like a wind farm, they're visible, they're different, and same thing with solar farm. They're different. They do take up land, and so it's a choice that communities have to make. And there are also a lot of benefits to having a project in your area too. It's generally a wind farm is going to become, if not the largest, then one of the largest taxpayers in the community. I think in general, it's often the largest taxpayer in the community. It's creating new jobs, and but there is we do see a lot of pushback. I think there's pushback to any sort of new development these days, whether it's a wind farm or a Walmart or an apartment building. It's something that any developer has to deal with, and so it's our job to get out in the communities and try to have real conversations and make sure that people feel listened to and included in the decisions. And it's also my job to try to figure out how to build new transmission and get the new grid upgrades that are needed to manage those higher levels of penetration. And then the raw materials, it's probably something you've seen in the news, the mining and access to silicon and things like that are going to be important. But I overall am super optimistic, and I think partly because of not just what we have with the current generation of technology, but also the new technology that's potentially down the road that can maybe enable greater flexibility and greater opportunity for carbon reductions. So that's the end of the official slideshow. I don't know if anybody has any further questions, but yes, ma'am.
We often drive north on Highway 42, and in Kiwani and the Algoma area, we've seen many agricultural farms that have become solar farms.
Yeah.
Do you have any feel for what those farmers get for their land? Is this a good way for them to retire? Is it any feel for it?
Yeah, so So I've spent a lot of time out in those communities talking to the farmers who are considering leases and things like that. And generally, what you hear from a farmer is they typically don't have 401ks. Their retirement plan is often a little shaky, and it is a pretty good source of revenue. For solar, they're typically getting a per acre rate for that lease, and they're pretty competitive. And for wind, you're typically getting, it's paid by the turbine. It can be either a flat fee or based on a percentage of the energy production. And they're long-term leases. I mean, anywhere from 20 to 30 years is kind of like the base, and usually like an option for extension. And for them, it's a really good opportunity. And then, I think that it is, you're seeing a lot more in agricultural areas. I would say that I've looked at how much solar it would take to meet some of the goals. And several years ago in Maryland, I was working on a legislative issue where we were starting to see some pushback from the farm community about how much land was being taken out of production. And this was back when Maryland, I think, had a 30% goal. And so by looking at the data, we figured that even if Maryland met all of that 30% goal with just farmland, just agricultural farmland, it would have only taken like 1/3 of 1% of all the agricultural land in Maryland. So even though it's, you drive past these farms and it looks like a lot of land, and it is, they're sizable, but based on like the total amount of agricultural capacity that's out there, it's pretty small. And there's also, I think, what's really interesting too is the idea of like agrivoltaics down the line. So that just means like doing some sort of production alongside the solar farm. So sheep are getting pretty common in solar fields as well. They do a really good job at keeping the grass cut, and that's a growing opportunity. I've spent a little bit of time looking into that in my previous employer. Talking to a farmer about how to acquire 1,000 head of sheep is not something I ever saw in my job description, but it was fun. But even like, there's, I think long-term, maybe there's the potential to grow things under the crops. But overall, what I would say is that, for farmers who are often strapped financially and don't have that long-term guaranteed revenue, it's a great opportunity for them.
So they generally lease, not sell?
Most of the time, yeah, for most of the time you're leasing. I don't know that I've ever bought property for a solar or wind farm.
My question, can you tell us, isn't it on? Okay. How far can the power be transmitted without losing? Because you lose some as it goes through the lines. So if we have a wind farm off of Whitefish Bay, how far can the power go?
Good question. It's different for AC or DC transmission. And I'm not an electrical engineer, so I don't really know the answer, but there's a limitation on AC transmission. At some point, you get so much losses that it becomes a cost issue. For DC, so the direct current, the losses are a lot less, and you can do it far. So the project that I'm primarily working on right now is called Grainbelt Express, and it's a proposed 800-mile transmission line from southwestern Kansas to the endpoint would be the border of Illinois and Indiana, and it would actually deliver power into the PJM grid system in Indiana, which PJM covers a bunch of the Midwest and a bunch of like the Mid-Atlantic. And so the idea is that in southwest Kansas, you have tremendous wind and solar resources, and it's in an area where there's not a lot of existing grid capacity. So if we can build something that's going to deliver that to where it's needed, and so this line again would be 804 miles, I think, total, and would deliver 5,000 megawatts of capacity. So it's hard to put that in perspective, but it's that's quite a lot of capacity. And the proposal is that we would deliver half of it into the MISO grid in Missouri, and then the other half of it into the PJM grid in Indiana. Actually, sorry, 1,500 megawatts into MISO and 1,000 into AECI, which is like a big co-op network in the area. But because it's a direct current line, you can have that long distance transmission without as much loss, and it's much more, that's much more beneficial. Yes, sir.
So on the wind farms, getting back to the other question, can the farmers actually still do their crops
Oh, yeah.
and cows and all the stuff you do on a farm?
Yeah, they can do just about anything that they were doing previously up to the base of the turbine. I've seen, you get a lot of pictures of like cows grazing right under the turbine. It's really, you need like a 5 to 10 foot buffer around the base. And there's usually like an access road to get to each turbine so you get the pickup out, and so you lose that a little bit. But yeah, that doesn't really change the land use, which really, that's what makes it really compatible for working farms. You spend a lot of time out in Texas and like West Texas where, running cattle or growing cotton and things like that. And it's, yeah, it's pretty easy for them. Farm, yeah, again, obviously solar is a little bit more challenging. I'm gonna take a bite. I've gotta have some stamina here. Yes, sir.
I used to live west of, I used to live near Dodgeville, Wisconsin,
Okay.
which is 40 miles west of Madison. And one of the farmers there, a large farm, had a wind farm.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of local lore saying that in each turbine there was a little man with an oil can that kept it running. But I used to go out and talk to the farmers, and they did. They planted crops. They had to be very selective, but they by and large the two farms that I talked to and got to know were very happy with how profitable it was.
Yep.
And one unique thing about both wind farms, they were owned by Florida Power and Light.
Yeah, that's his company.
Yeah, yeah, and they said that they were very good to work with, and reasonable, and they paid their bills quickly. So it was a real positive, to my mind, that they were going to win no matter what happened.
Yep.
So it was a fascinating part of the new America.
Great
So
to hear.
thank you.
Yes, sir.
Maybe one more question. Seeing none, I'll ask my question. There must be some really interesting, like sort of village dynamics when you have this farmer who stands to make quite a bit of money,
Yeah.
but then you have that you were alluding to, kind of this consensus process in the town that has to say yes. I mean, that seems like it seems like it just sets up some conflict within these kind of little places where people have to stay neighbors.
It can be hard. I mean, I think that the fights over wind farms can be really vitriolic and be challenging. But historically, the when leasing a turbine was really used to be all about you find a farmer and talk to him and sign a lease and move on. And there wasn't this community engagement process that was as important. But because of I think with the growth and because of they are getting bigger and more visible, it is pretty key. So like some of the things that I've seen happening is more of a consensus-based process, and so instead of initially targeting a couple big landowners and getting them on board and building the snowball, can you engage a group of community leaders early on? Can you engage? Can you pull landowners together? When I was trying to lease land in Texas, a year or so ago, I would get 10 to 15 farmers together at once, and so they were all having the same conversation. They're all confident they're getting the same information, but you could even formalize it. My former company has tried some efforts where they're actually developing an organized process to get community feedback on where do they think the most appropriate place for a wind farm is in their county, what's important to them, and then also changing the lease structure too, because the way it historically had worked out is that if you could sign a lease, but if you didn't get a turbine on your property, you weren't really getting paid. it was really, the revenue was going to the property owner himself. And you've seen a lot more of a shift towards what's called community-based leases, where there's more of a revenue share among everybody who's signing in the area. And so even if you don't have a turbine, you can still see some revenue and things like that to try to make it a little more equitable. It's still, I don't think you're ever going to find a scenario where there's no controversy anywhere, but we're dealing with a lot of misinformation and a lot of bad internet research too, oftentimes. And so it becomes, I would say in general, it's less directly political than you would think, but it is, you do get, some of the looseness around facts that you see in other parts of life these days are very prevalent around wind and solar too, which makes things more challenging because, as a developer, you're kind of held to a higher standard, and so we're trying to operate with facts, and sometimes people aren't operating with facts, and so that's harder too.
Well, thank you for all your efforts in the community and for your time with us today.
Thank you. That was my pithy 80s movie reference if we didn't get the questions earlier, but thank you all so much. Happy to chat. What's that? Oh, it's okay. This is like